brought home the woman he intended to marry. Her name was Amara Bennett. She arrived at the family estate in a modest car, wearing a simple dress, carrying nothing but a quiet smile and a bottle of wine she had chosen with obvious care. The family watched her step out of that little car, and, in the space of a single glance, they decided everything about her. They decided she was ordinary. They decided she was beneath them. They decided, before she had spoken a single word, that she was a mistake their son would eventually correct. Vivian smiled her most gracious smile that day, and behind that smile she had already begun to plan how she would remove Amara from their lives. Before we go any further, if you are enjoying this story so far, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what you are about to hear is a story about pride and about the terrible price a family pays when it decides it knows the worth of a person on sight. It is a story with 3 questions buried inside it, and every one of them matters. Who was Amara Bennett, really? Why did she allow a family to believe a lie about her for 7 long years? And what, exactly, was waiting for the Hensleys on the 41st floor of that gleaming downtown tower? Stay with me, because the answers are not what anyone expected. Amara had not come from the kind of money the Hensleys respected, and this was the first mark against her in Vivian's private ledger. She had grown up in a small apartment, on the wrong side of a city none of them had ever bothered to visit, raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who had left before she was old enough to remember his face. She learned early that no one was coming to rescue her, and so she rescued herself, one long night at a time, studying while other children slept, working while other students partied, building something out of nothing, with a patience that would have frightened the Hensleys if they had understood it. But they never understood it, because they never asked. They looked at her second-hand car and her simple dress, and they saw a girl who had gotten lucky. They had no idea what they were looking at. What they were looking at was one of the most quietly powerful people in the entire country, though not one of them would have believed it. By the time Amara married David, she had already spent nearly 2 decades building a company from a single rented desk into something vast, a private investment firm that moved silently behind hundreds of businesses whose names the Hensleys spoke with reverence. She had done it without a famous surname, without inherited money, without anyone handing her a single thing, and she had learned, along the way, a lesson that would shape everything that followed. She had learned that the people who most need you to know how important they are almost always turn out to be the ones with the least real power. So she stopped announcing herself. She let people underestimate her, and she discovered it was the single greatest advantage she had ever possessed. There was a reason Amara never told the Hensleys who she was, and it went far deeper than pride. For her whole adult life, she had watched money twist every relationship it touched. She had watched people smile at her differently once they learned what she was worth. She had watched friends become calculators and suitors become salesmen, all of them recalculating her value the moment the numbers came into view. And she was tired, bone-tired, of being a sum instead of a person. So when she met David, a man who seemed to want nothing from her, who did not know and did not ask, she made a quiet decision that would cost her dearly. She would let him love the woman and never mention the empire. She wanted, just once in her life, to be chosen for who she was. It was the most human wish in the world. It nearly destroyed her. David Hensley was not a cruel man, and that is important to understand, because the story is not as simple as a villain and a victim. He was something more common and, in its own way, more dangerous. He was weak. He had grown up under his mother's thumb, taught from childhood that Vivian's approval was the sun around which the family orbited, and he had never once found the courage to step out of that orbit. He loved Amara. That was never in doubt. But he loved peace more, and he loved his mother's approval more, and whenever those things came into conflict with his wife, it was always his wife who was asked to bend. Amara mistook his gentleness for goodness for a very long time. It would take her years, and a great deal of pain, to understand the difference. A man who will not defend you is not gentle. He is simply gone when it counts. For the first year of the marriage, Amara tried. She tried harder than she had ever tried at anything, harder than she had worked building her company, because a company obeys logic and a family does not. She learned Vivian's preferences and honored them. She endured Rebecca's sharp remarks and Caroline's soft cruelties without complaint. She set the table the way Vivian liked it and changed it silently when Vivian decided that same evening that she preferred it another way. She absorbed 1,000 small humiliations the way a wall absorbs rain, telling herself the sun would come, telling herself that if she was only patient enough, only kind enough, only small enough, the family would eventually open a door and let her in. She did not yet understand that the door had never existed. There was only a wall, and she was throwing herself against it. The cruelty in that house was rarely loud, and that is what made it so effective and so hard to name. Vivian never raised her voice at Amara, never insulted her outright where a witness might carry the tale. Instead, she had perfected, over a lifetime, the art of the small wound, the comment that could always be denied, the correction disguised as help, the concern that was really contempt. She would praise the other women at the table and let the silence around Amara say the rest. She would plan a family gathering and forget, so terribly sorry, to mention it to Amara until it was far too late to attend. She would ask, with wide and innocent eyes, whether Amara was feeling quite well, because she looked so tired, so worn, so much older than her years. 1,000 paper cuts, not one of them ever deep enough to bleed alone. Rebecca and Caroline had learned their mother's methods the way children always do, by watching what won her approval and copying it. Rebecca, the elder daughter, was clever and sharp-tongued, and she used both to make Amara feel foolish in front of the family, turning ordinary conversation into little traps. Caroline, the younger, was softer only in appearance. She specialized in pity, which is often crueler than open scorn, because it wears the mask of kindness. Together, the sisters built a private language of glances and half-smiles, an entire grammar of exclusion that Amara could feel pressing against her skin, but could never quite catch in the open. She would leave those family dinners with a headache she could not explain and a heaviness she could not point to, carrying the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent an entire evening being told, wordlessly, that she does not belong and never will. But the wound the family returned to most often, the bruise they could not stop pressing, was that after several years of marriage, Amara had given them no grandchild. They spoke of it as though it were a moral failing, a debt she had promised and refused to pay. Vivian would cradle other people's babies at family gatherings and gaze at Amara over the infant's head with an expression of theatrical sorrow. Rebecca would mention, loudly, some cousin who had struggled the very same way, poor thing, before her husband finally did the sensible thing and moved on. No one ever asked Amara what she wanted. No one asked what she and David had quietly endured, the hopes they had held, and the losses they had carried alone in the dark. To the Hensleys, her body was simply one more way she had failed to be enough for their son, and their name. And through every moment of it, David said nothing. He would sit at those long dinners and watch his mother and his sisters carve pieces off his wife, and he would study his plate, or find some reason to leave the room, and afterward, in the quiet of the car, he would tell Amara that she was being too sensitive. His family loved her, he would say. That was simply how they talked to everyone. She only needed to try a little harder to fit in. Every single time he said it, something inside Amara eased a little further shut, like a door closing slowly in a house she had once believed was warm. She was learning, against her own will, a truth she did not want to know. The man she had married would always, when it mattered most, choose the comfort of his family over the dignity of his wife. And a marriage cannot survive that knowledge forever. What none of them knew What would have stopped their laughter cold if they had known was how Amara spent her days. Every weekday morning, she rose before the rest of the house woke, and she dressed quietly, and she drove away in that modest little car they all quietly mocked. The family assumed she went to some small, forgettable job, the kind of work that barely justified the trouble of keeping her around. It never occurred to a single one of them to wonder, because you do not grow curious about a person you have already decided is beneath curiosity. If they had followed her, just once, they would have watched that little car drive past the modest office park they imagined, and continue downtown, deep into the glass heart of the city, to a tower that scraped the clouds. And they would have watched hundreds of people rise from their desks as she walked in, because the name carved above those doors was hers. On the 41st floor of that tower, behind a long wall of glass etched with her company's name, Amara Bennett was a different woman entirely. There she was not corrected, not pitied, not moved quietly from one room to another. There she made decisions that shifted the fortunes of entire industries, and she made them with a calm certainty that had taken her 20 years to earn. The contrast between her two lives was so complete that some mornings she genuinely felt like two separate people. There was the woman who was told she looked tired and old, who was forgotten off guest lists and lectured in the car. And there was the woman whose single signature could save a dying company or let it sink. She kept those two worlds sealed apart, and she told herself she did it to protect her marriage. The truth was something else. The truth was that she was keeping an escape open. Then, on an ordinary autumn evening in the third year, everything quietly changed, though Amara did not know it yet. Vivian gathered the family for a dinner and, for the first time, did not invite Amara at all. She called it nothing important, a small family meal, and David went alone because arguing was harder than going. And around that table, over low voices and expensive wine, Vivian laid out a plan she had been shaping in private for months. The marriage, she said, had failed to produce what a marriage was for. The family name needed a future, an heir, a fresh start. And she had found someone, she announced, with the calm of a woman who has already decided everything. Someone young, someone grateful, someone who understood her place in a way that Amara never had. David listened to his mother describe the replacement of his wife, and he did not say no. That silence was the moment the story turned. Her name was Bianca Reyes, and when the family first brought her into the house, they introduced her as nothing more than a guest. A friend of a friend, Vivian explained, new to the city and in need of a place to stay for a little while. And wouldn't it be a kindness to help? Amara, who had spent years being trained not to question the strange decisions of the family she had married into, welcomed the young woman with the same open warmth she offered everyone. She made up the guest room with her own hands. She cooked a meal to help Bianca feel at home. She did not understand, could not have understood, that she was preparing a bed for the very woman chosen to replace her, and the family watched her do it, and said nothing, and some of them, to their private shame, quietly enjoyed the watching. Bianca was young, striking in the way that turns heads across a crowded room, and she carried herself with an ease around wealthy people that suggested she had spent a long time studying how they moved. She was not, at her core, a cruel person, and this matters a great deal to the story, because it does not end where you think it will. Bianca had been fed a version of events in which she was the heroine. She had been told that David's marriage was already dead in everything but name, that the wife was cold and distant and absent, that the family ached for someone warm to bring life back into the house. She had been promised things: security, status, a place inside a powerful family. And she was young enough and hungry enough to believe that the promises were real, and the people making them were kind. She saw Amara as an obstacle, never a victim, because that was the only way anyone had ever described her. For weeks the arrangement wore the polite mask of hospitality, but the mask slipped a little further with every passing day. Bianca stopped being introduced as a guest and started being treated as family. Her opinions were invited at dinner, while Amara's were ignored. Vivian took her shopping, bought her clothes the family could scarcely afford, showed her off to relatives as though she were the genuine article, and Amara merely a temporary stand-in who had not yet been cleared away. David, trapped between the woman he had married and the woman his mother had chosen for him, retreated so far into himself that he became a kind of ghost in his own home, present in body and gone in every way that counted, and Amara watched all of it with a growing stillness that the family badly misread as acceptance. It was not acceptance. It was a woman gathering herself in a place too deep for them to reach. The day they rearranged the house, Amara was downtown, seated at the head of a very different kind of table, deciding the fate of a company worth more than everything the Hensleys had ever owned. She came home after dark to find her belongings moved. Not thrown out, nothing so honest as that. Simply moved, quietly, from the master bedroom into a small room down the hall, her clothes folded into unfamiliar drawers, her books stacked on a stranger's shelf, as though she had agreed to this, as though it were the most natural arrangement in the world. Bianca's things were in the master bedroom now. Amara stood in the doorway of the room that had been hers, and she felt something inside her go very cold and very clear, the way still water goes silent in the instant before it freezes. She did not cry, she did not shout, she simply understood, at last, exactly what they believed she was worth. And in that silence, standing in the doorway of a room that was no longer hers, Amara made a decision. For 7 years she had made herself smaller and smaller, folding her true self away piece by piece, all in the hope of being loved by people who had decided on the day they met her that she never would be. She had offered them the most honest version of herself, a woman stripped of every advantage she possessed, and they had looked at that honest woman and judged her worthless. She had given them her heart, and they had handed it back and gone shopping for a replacement. Something in her, that night, stopped hoping. And in the space where the hope had been, something far steadier took its place. Not rage. Rage burns out. This was quieter and far more dangerous. It was clarity. She finally saw them exactly as they were, and she began to decide what they were worth to her. She did not yet know that the two worlds she had kept so carefully apart were about to collide with the force of a car crash, and that she would be the only person in the room who saw it coming. She did not yet know that the Hensley fortune the family wore, like armor, was a beautiful painting of a house, with nothing standing behind the front wall. She did not yet know that within a matter of months, Vivian herself would ride an elevator up to the 41st floor of a gleaming tower, clutching a folder full of pleas, to beg a stranger to save the family from ruin. And she did not yet know the cruelest and most perfect detail of all, the one that would bring the whole story full circle, that the stranger Vivian was coming to beg, the ruthless executive who held every Hensley future in the palm of one hand, was the quiet daughter-in-law they had folded away into a small room down the hall. But she was about to find out, and so were they. The collision the two worlds had been drifting toward for years finally began on an ordinary afternoon, in a quiet office on the 41st floor, with the soft sound of a folder sliding across a polished desk. Amara was reviewing acquisition targets, the ordinary traffic of a firm like hers, companies in trouble, businesses seeking rescue or sale, names that meant nothing to her beyond their numbers. Her assistant, a sharp and fiercely loyal woman named Grace, who had stood beside Amara for more than a decade, set one particular file down in front of her and paused. There was something careful in the way Grace paused, the manner of a person delivering news she cannot quite believe herself. She said only that Amara would want to look at this one personally. Amara opened the folder. She read the name of the distressed company begging for a rescue investment. And for a long moment, she did not move at all. The name on the file was Hensley, the failing company quietly drowning in debt The business whose collapse would soon send Vivian up an elevator clutching a folder of pleas was the very family that had spent 7 years making Amara feel small at their dinner table. She sat with the file open in front of her and felt the strangest sensation move through her, something colder and clearer than triumph. For years she had kept her 2 lives sealed apart, and now, without her lifting a single finger, the wall between them had dissolved. The people who had judged her worthless had, in their desperation, come crawling toward the one door in the entire world they should have feared most, and they had no idea whose door it was. Amara closed the folder slowly. She told Grace to bring her everything, every number, every debt, every secret the Hensleys had buried. What Amara's firm uncovered over the following weeks would have astonished the family, because much of it the family did not fully understand about itself. The Hensley fortune, it turned out, was a beautiful facade with almost nothing behind it. For 2 full generations they had lived on the reputation of wealth rather than the substance of it, spending against a legacy that had stopped growing long ago, borrowing quietly against assets they described to the world as vast and unshakable. Vivian's late husband, a charming man who had never once in his life been told no, had left behind debts so carefully hidden that even his own children did not grasp their true and terrible shape. The family that looked down on Amara for saving leftovers was, in cold reality, 1 bad quarter away from losing everything, and had been that way for years, papering over the widening cracks with borrowed money and borrowed time. The family business itself, a mid-sized manufacturing and distribution company that had once been genuinely successful, had been slowly starved by the same pride that ran through everything the Hensleys touched. No one in the family wanted to hear bad news, and so the people who worked for them learned, quickly, to stop delivering it. Contracts were lost and blamed on the market. Talented employees left and were called disloyal. Vivian ran the company exactly the way she ran her household, by deciding what was true and punishing anyone who dared suggest otherwise. But a business, unlike a frightened family, cannot be bullied into pretending. The numbers did not care about the Hensley name or the Hensley pride. The numbers simply fell, quarter after quarter, year after year, until the afternoon arrived when the bank made a phone call that could no longer be ignored, and the whole family finally understood how close to the edge they had been standing all along. They needed an investor, not a loan, they were far past the reach of loans, but a full rescue, a firm large enough and bold enough to buy in, take control, and pour real money behind a name that had run out of everything except the name itself. The family gathered in crisis, and for the first time in years, the effortless mask of wealth cracked wide open, and the fear beneath it showed through. Rebecca wept and blamed the economy. Caroline blamed everyone in the room by turns. David sat in silence, as he always did, the habit of silence having eaten so far into him that he no longer knew how to do anything else. And Vivian, pale and rigid at the head of the table, insisted the family would survive this the way it had survived everything, through sheer force of will and the right connections. She began, that very night, to make calls. She had no idea she was dialing her way toward Amara. It took weeks of desperate, humiliating effort. Doors that had opened for the Hensley name all their lives now stayed firmly shut. Old friends who had dined at their table suddenly could not be reached, their assistants apologetic, their calendars mysteriously full. The name Vivian, had wielded like a master key for half a century, turned out to open almost nothing once the money behind it was gone. She learned, slowly and bitterly, exactly how much of the family's welcome in the world had been rented rather than owned. And then, at last, one name surfaced that could actually help. A firm large enough and daring enough to take on a rescue this troubled. A firm known throughout the industry for turning dying companies around. The family's advisors spoke the name with a mixture of hope and open dread, because this firm was known to be exacting, and its chief executive was said to be one of the most formidable people alive. The firm was called Meridian Holdings. Vivian wrote the name down on a slip of paper and underlined it twice, and she had no idea, none at all, that she had just written down the name of the woman sleeping in the small room down the hall from the master bedroom she had given away. The advisors warned her that Meridian's chief executive was famously private, that photographs were scarce, that even seasoned people in the industry could not claim to know the face behind the name. To Vivian, strangely, this was almost a comfort, because she had spent her entire life charming powerful strangers, and she believed, right up until the elevator doors opened, that she could charm this one too. She spent the drive home already rehearsing. She would be gracious. She would be grateful. She would make this ruthless executive feel the full and famous weight of the Hensley charm. But before the two worlds could finally collide on the 41st floor, the family made one last attempt to close the door on Amara for good, and it was, in some ways, the cruelest thing they ever did to her, because they dressed it up as mercy. Vivian sat Amara down one evening, with David silent and hollow at her side, and a lawyer's thick envelope resting on the table between them. And in the gentle, reasonable voice she saved for her most brutal moments, Vivian explained that everyone would simply be happier if Amara stepped aside. The marriage had run its natural course, she said. There was no need for ugliness, no need for a scene. Amara had only to sign a few papers, accept a modest sum in recognition of her years with the family, and leave quietly, and everyone could move forward with their dignity intact. Bianca, unspoken but understood by all, would take the place being cleared. The papers were an insult wearing the costume of generosity. They offered Amara a fraction of what even the most modest settlement would have granted her, and in exchange, they demanded that she surrender any future claim on the family, that she vanish cleanly and completely and never trouble the Hensley name again. Vivian slid the pages across the table with the very same gesture Grace had used weeks earlier in a very different room, and the echo of it was not lost on Amara for a single second. She looked down at the papers. She looked at David, who could not lift his eyes to meet hers. She looked at Vivian, whose face held the particular satisfaction of a woman certain she has finally won. And rising up through all the old grief, Amara felt something she had not felt in years. Not anger, something far steadier and far more dangerous. She felt calm. She signed. That was the part that stunned them, and the part not one of them would understand until it was far too late. She picked up the pen and signed the papers cleanly, without argument, without tears, with a composure that unsettled Vivian more deeply than any outburst ever could have. The family read that calm as surrender. They quietly congratulated themselves on how smoothly it had all gone, on how sensible the girl had turned out to be at the very end. What they could not see was that Amara was not surrendering anything she valued. She was releasing a marriage that had already died, letting go of a family that had never truly held her, and she was doing it on paper that would very soon mean nothing at all, because the ground beneath the entire Hensley world was already shifting. She signed away a life she had outgrown, and she smiled, faintly, because she knew what was coming, and they did not. But Amara did not sign everything. Tucked among the pages, Vivian pushed across the table, folded into the routine legal language, like a stone hidden in bread, was a single document the family's lawyer had included almost as an afterthought. It was a broad release concerning any and all financial dealings between Amara and the family, past and present. A clause so sweeping that a careless person would have signed it without a second glance. Amara was not careless. She read it once, and then she read it again, more slowly, and she understood, in a way the family's own lawyer clearly did not, exactly what that document had been designed to bury. She set that one page aside, quietly, and said she would need her own counsel to review that specific clause before she signed it. No one argued over a single sheet of paper when the important pages were already signed, and the girl was already leaving. That withheld page went into her bag that night, folded neatly, and Amara told no one what it meant. She did not fully explain it, even to Grace, not yet. She simply carried it out of that house, the way a person carries a key to a door no one else knows exists. And she waited. She had learned long ago that patience is the truest form of power, that the loudest person in the room is almost never the one who wins, and that the greatest advantage in any situation belongs to the one who knows something the others do not. The Hensleys believed they had cleared her out of their lives with a few signatures and a modest check. In truth, they had handed the most dangerous woman they would ever meet the one weapon that could end them, and then walked her politely to the door. And now, the family had a savior to meet. They only had to ride an elevator to the top of a tower to do it. The meeting was arranged the way these meetings always are, through advisors and assistants and carefully worded emails, and for 2 full weeks, the Hensley family prepared for it as though preparing for a coronation. Vivian treated the coming appointment with Meridian Holdings as the single most important event of her life, and in a way it was, because everything the family had left now depended on convincing a stranger to save them. She drilled the family on what to say and what to leave carefully unsaid. She rehearsed a version of the company's collapse that laid the blame everywhere except on herself. She bought new clothes the family truly could not afford, because appearances, she insisted, were everything, and the chief executive of Meridian must see a family worth rescuing, rather than a family worth pitying. She practiced her gracious smile in the mirror. She had no idea who would be smiling back. Bianca was brought along, and the choice to bring her revealed everything about how the family now saw itself. She was dressed with enormous care and presented as David's partner, the fresh new face of the Hensley future, living proof that the family was moving forward and worth every dollar of investment. Not one of them found it strange that David's actual wife had been erased from the picture so completely that a woman he was not even married to now stood in her place at the most important meeting of the family's life. Bianca herself was uneasy, in a way she could not fully explain. In recent weeks, she had begun to notice the cracks in the story she had been sold, the debts that kept surfacing, the desperation behind the family's charm, the way their warmth toward her seemed to rise and fall with her usefulness. But she pushed the doubts down. She had come too far to turn back. On the morning of the meeting, the family rode up in the elevator of a gleaming downtown tower, higher and higher past floor after floor of glass and light, and Vivian gripped her folder of pleas and reminded everyone, one final time, to smile, to defer, to make this powerful stranger feel the full weight of the Hensley name. The elevator slowed as it approached the 41st floor. A soft chime sounded somewhere above their heads, and in the last second before the doors opened, David felt something he could not name, a cold recognition rising from somewhere deep inside him, a sense that the ground was no longer where he had left it. He did not have time to understand the feeling. The doors slid apart, and the family stepped out onto a floor whose long glass wall was etched, in tall, clean letters, with the very word Vivian had underlined twice, and beneath it, smaller but unmistakable, a name. They were led through the floor by Grace, who said very little and revealed nothing, and who walked with the quiet authority of a person entrusted with a secret worth keeping. The family followed her past open offices and glass-walled conference rooms, past employees who glanced up and then quickly, deliberately, looked away. And with every step, Vivian's confidence grew rather than shrank, because the wealth surrounding her was real and enormous, and exactly the kind of thing she understood in her bones. This was a world she believed, deep down, that she belonged in. She composed her face into its most gracious expression as Grace stopped before a tall door at the end of the floor, paused with her hand on the handle, and opened it onto a long boardroom with a wall of windows that held the entire city glittering in the light. At the far end of that room, a woman in a tailored suit stood with her back to them, looking out over the skyline. Vivian began her rehearsed greeting at once, warm and deferential, thanking the chief executive of Meridian for the great honor of this meeting. promising that the family would not waste a moment of her valuable time. The woman at the window let the greeting run all the way to its polished end, and then she turned around, slowly, unhurried, and the light of the whole city fell across a face the family knew, a face they had corrected and dismissed and pitied and folded away into a small room down the hall. The face of the woman they had decided 7 years ago on sight was worth almost nothing. Amara looked at them with perfect, unhurried composure, and in a voice they had never once heard her use, calm and clear and entirely her own, she said a single word, "Welcome." And then, into a silence that had turned to stone, she said, "Please, sit down." For a long moment, no one in the family moved at all, because the human mind refuses, at first, to accept a thing that rearranges the entire world in a single instant. Rebecca made a small, broken sound in her throat. Caroline reached blindly for the back of a chair that was not where she thought it was. Bianca went very pale, understanding faster than the others, because she alone carried no long history to protect, and could see the situation for exactly what it was. And Vivian, who had spent her entire life sorting every human being she met into those who mattered and those who did not, stood frozen in the doorway of a room she had believed she was entering as a supplicant to a stranger. She stared at the daughter-in-law she had thrown away, and she felt the ground she had stood on for 50 years simply cease to exist beneath her feet. She had come to beg a stranger. The stranger was Amara. David could not speak. He stood behind his mother and looked at his wife, at the woman he had failed to defend across 100 dinners, at the woman whose belongings he had allowed them to move down the hall while he studied his plate. And he saw her now completely, for the very first time, and the seeing was almost more than he could bear. She was not cold. She had never once been cold. She had been carrying an entire empire alone, quietly, while his family carved pieces off her for sport, and she had never used the weapon she held, not to win a single argument, not to earn a scrap of their respect, not even to make them stop. She had only ever wanted to be loved, and they had looked at the single most remarkable person any of them would ever meet and decided she was not enough. Amara held his gaze for one long moment. In her face there was no triumph, only a deep and final sorrow. Amara let them sit before she spoke, and she let the silence do its patient work, and when she finally began, she did not raise her voice, because she had learned long ago that the quietest voice in the room is the one everyone strains hardest to hear. She told them, plainly, that she knew precisely why they had come. She knew the company was dying. She knew the debts, the hidden ones and the visible ones, better than they knew them themselves, because her firm had spent weeks studying the wreckage of the Hensley business before this meeting, and there was very little about their ruin that she had not seen laid bare in cold, honest columns of numbers. She watched the family slowly absorb the fact that the person they had spent 7 years underestimating now knew every secret they had spent a lifetime hiding, and that she had known it all while she sat silent at their table. Then she did something none of them expected. She did not gloat. She opened a folder of her own, and patiently, without cruelty, she walked them through the true state of the company they had run into the ground. She named the contracts they had lost through sheer arrogance. She named the good and capable people they had driven out for the crime of telling the truth. She held up a mirror, and she made them look into it, and the looking was its own kind of justice, sharper than any insult could ever be, because every word of it was true, and none of it could be denied. Vivian tried, just once, to interrupt with the old familiar charm, the tone that had opened every door in her life, and Amara simply waited, silent and still, until the charm ran out of air and died quietly in the older woman's throat, and the room understood that those old tricks would never work again. She spoke of the years inside the house too, but differently than they feared she would. She did not list every wound. She did not need to. She said only that she had come into the family with an open heart, that she had offered them the most honest thing she possessed, which was simply herself, a woman stripped of every advantage, and that they had decided that honest woman was worthless. She said she had let them believe she was small because she had wanted, just once in her life, to be loved for who she was and not for what she owned, and that this, perhaps, had been her one true mistake, because you cannot teach people to treasure what you have spent all your strength hiding. There was no anger in the way she said it. There was something far worse for the family to hear. There was the calm of a woman who has stopped needing anything from them at all. And then Amara turned to David, and the whole room seemed to lean toward the two of them, because everyone present understood that this was the center of it, the wound beneath all the other wounds. She looked at the man she had married, and she asked him a single quiet question, the kind you ask when you already know the answer. You had one thing to protect, she said, one person who asked you for nothing in this world but your loyalty. When they moved my things down the hall, when they brought another woman into our home while I slept in it, when your mother slid those papers across the table, you had 100 chances to speak one single word. Where were you, David? He opened his mouth, and no sound came out, because there was no answer that was not also a confession, and they both knew it. The silence that followed was the truest thing he had ever given her. It was Bianca who finally broke that silence, and what she said changed the entire shape of the room. She had sat through the whole reckoning growing paler and stiller, and when she at last found her voice, it shook, but it did not stop. She said that she too had been lied to. She said that everything she had been told about this family and this marriage had been a careful story built to use her. She had been promised security and status and a place among people of real substance, and she was only now, in this room, understanding that the substance had never existed, that she had been brought into the house not as a partner but as a tool, a young and convenient replacement for a wife the family had decided to discard. She looked at Amara then, not with rivalry, but with something much closer to recognition. Two women, used by the very same people, for the very same cold purpose. Amara had not expected this, and it moved her more than any apology from the family ever could have. She saw in Bianca a younger version of a mistake she understood down to her bones, the mistake of trusting people who have already privately decided exactly what you are worth to them. She saw a woman handed a role in someone else's scheme and told with a smile that it was a love story. And rather than treat Bianca as an enemy, Amara chose to treat her as what she truly was, another person the Hensleys had been perfectly willing to spend and then throw away. Something passed between the two women in that boardroom in that moment. Not friendship, not yet, but the quiet beginning of an understanding that would have astonished the family, if the family had been capable, just then, of understanding anything at all beyond the ruin closing in around them. Then Bianca said the thing that no one saw coming, the thing she had been carrying without fully grasping its weight. In the weeks she had lived in that house, being quietly groomed to take Amara's place, she had overheard conversations she was never meant to hear, and she had seen documents left carelessly on Vivian's desk, and she had slowly come to understand that the family's troubles were not only the ordinary troubles of a business run into the ground by pride. There was something else, something the family had been hiding, not only from Amara, but from everyone. A matter involving money that had never belonged to them, and promises made long ago to people who had trusted the Hensley name. Bianca did not fully understand what she had seen, but Amara, listening in perfect stillness, understood at once. And slowly, deliberately, she reached into her bag and drew out a single folded page. The page was the document she had refused to sign, the broad financial release the family's lawyer had slipped in among the divorce papers, the one clause she had quietly set aside, claiming she needed her own counsel to review it. She unfolded it now on the boardroom table, smoothing it flat, and she explained in the same steady voice what it had truly been designed to do. Years earlier, long before Amara had ever met David, the Hensley company had raised money from a group of private investors to fund an expansion that never actually happened. The money had quietly vanished into the family's mounting debts, and the investors had been fed a series of comforting lies, and the entire matter had been buried so deep that the family believed it would never surface. But one of those early investors, operating through a fund that concealed her name behind layers of paperwork, had been Amara herself. She had not known at the time that the failing company she had put a modest sum into was in any way connected to the man she was slowly falling in love with. The investment had been small, one of hundreds her firm quietly made, and the Hensley name had meant nothing to her yet. By the time she understood the connection, she was already married, already folded into a family that dismissed her daily, and she had made the quiet choice to say nothing, to keep that thread hidden along with everything else, telling herself it did not matter. But it mattered now, because that sweeping release the family had tried so hard to make her sign was never really about the divorce at all. It had been carefully designed to make her surrender, forever and unknowingly, any claim arising from that old buried fraud, to sign away the one piece of leverage that could hold the family accountable. And she had not signed it. The room understood, slowly, what this meant. The Hensleys had not simply run a business into the ground through pride and bad decisions. They had taken money under false pretenses and hidden it for years, and Amara held the proof in her hand, and she had held it, unsigned, folded in her bag, the entire time. She could destroy them completely. She could hand that single page to regulators and to the other defrauded investors, and watch the Hensley name end, not merely in bankruptcy, but in disgrace, the kind of ruin that follows a family for generations and attaches itself to a name forever. Vivian understood it first, and the very last of her composure crumbled away, and for the first time in the whole long story she had nothing to say. No charm, no correction, no version of events that could survive contact with a single sheet of paper held in the steady hand of the woman she had thrown away like something used up. And then Amara made her choice, and it was not the choice a single person in that room expected. She did not destroy them. She looked at the family that had spent 7 years slowly destroying her, and she understood, with perfect clarity, that ruining them completely would only make her, in the end, into a version of them. Someone who wins by wounding. Someone who measures her own worth by another person's ruin. And she had spent her entire life refusing, at enormous cost, to become that. So instead, she laid down terms. She would rescue the company, she said, because hundreds of ordinary employees and their families depended on it and did not deserve to suffer for the sins of the people who owned it. But she would take control of it entirely. The Hensleys would keep their name. They would lose forever their power over it, and over her. The defrauded investors, she said, would be quietly and fully repaid, every last dollar, out of whatever remained of the family's personal assets, whatever the cost to their comfort or their pride. David would sign the divorce his mother had been so eager to arrange because Amara was finally, completely and peacefully done. And then she turned to Bianca, and she offered her something too, something no one in that family had ever offered the young woman, a way out, a real job, earned on her own merits, far from these people, in a company where her worth would be measured by what she built and not by whom she could be traded to, a chance to belong to no one but herself. Justice, it turned out, did not have to wear the face of revenge. Sometimes justice simply looks like a woman refusing, at last, to let anyone in the world decide her value but herself. In the months that followed, Meridian Holdings absorbed the dying Hensley Company, and under new and honest leadership, the business that arrogance had nearly killed began, slowly and painfully, to recover. The employees who had learned to swallow bad news learned instead that the truth was safe to speak again. Vivian, stripped of the power she had wielded her entire life, grew quiet in a way her children had never once seen, and whether it was genuine regret or simply exhaustion, none of them could say for certain. Rebecca and Caroline, forced at last to build lives that did not rest on a borrowed name, discovered slowly and painfully that they were capable of more than cruelty. And David signed the papers, and moved out of the house that had never truly been a home and began the long work of living with what his silence had cost him. Bianca took the position Amara offered her, far from the family that had used her, and she was good at it, far better than anyone who had ever underestimated her would have guessed. In time, the strange bond that had formed in that boardroom grew into something like a real friendship. Two women who had been handed the very same lie and had each, in her own way, chosen to walk out of it into a life that was truly hers. And Amara returned to the life she had built with her own hands, the one that had always, quietly, been hers. And for the first time in 7 long years, she was entirely herself in every room she entered, with nothing hidden and nothing folded away, having finally learned that the door she had kept open all that time was never an escape from her marriage. It was the way back to herself. She never truly regretted keeping her secret, not in the end, because it had taught her the one thing she most needed to know. The people who love you for what you can give them will leave the very moment the giving stops. And the people who love you for who you truly are will still be standing beside you when everything else in the world is gone. She had offered the Hensleys the honest version of herself and watched them throw it away, and in doing so, they had shown her exactly who they were, long before she ever had to reveal who she was. That was the strange gift hidden inside the wound. They had underestimated her, and in underestimating her, they had told her the whole truth about themselves, while she still had time to save her own life. So here is the question worth sitting with, the one this entire story places gently into your hands. Amara spent 7 years making herself small so that she might be loved for who she truly was, and it nearly cost her everything she had. Was she wrong to hide her power for so long, or was she right to want, more than anything, to be loved for herself and not for what she owned? And if you had been the one standing in that boardroom, holding the single page that could destroy the people who had tried so hard to erase you, would you have chosen the mercy that Amara chose? Or would you have wanted them to feel every ounce of what they made you feel, for every one of those 7 years? Tell me honestly, down in the comments below, because I read them, and I believe this is exactly the kind of story that shows us who we really are.